When I arrived at my private island, I found 31 cabins built without my permission. The HOA thought they owned my land, but my deed froze their million-dollar resort before it opened. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The first thing I heard was not the sound of waves. It was the sound of construction. A hammer striking wood, engines running, workers shouting across the water. And when I looked toward my private island, I saw something that made my hands tighten around the boat's steering wheel. Someone had built a resort on my land. My name is Nathaniel Brooks, and for most of my life, that island had been the one place where everything felt untouched. My family owned it for 3 generations, long before the nearby coastal community even existed. It wasn't a vacation property listed on a map. It wasn't empty land waiting for someone to develop it. It was a piece of my family's history surrounded by blue water and protected by one thing that mattered more than anything else: ownership. I had been away for several months handling business matters on the mainland. During that time, I received a few strange messages from neighbors mentioning activity near the island. At first, I thought it was simple maintenance. Maybe someone had repaired the old dock. Maybe the local fishermen had used the area temporarily. I never imagined what I would find when I finally returned. As my boat moved closer to the shoreline, the view became clearer. The old wooden dock I remembered was gone. In its place was a brand new pier stretching into the water. Behind it stood rows of small wooden cabins, perfectly aligned between the trees. 31 of them. 31 buildings sitting on an island that belonged to me. The smell reached me before I stepped onto the shore. Fresh-cut lumber, paint, diesel fuel from construction equipment. The sounds of a quiet island had been replaced by the noise of a business project. Workers stopped when they saw my boat approaching. Some looked confused. Others quickly looked away. I stepped onto the dock and walked toward the nearest cabin, trying to understand what I was seeing. A sign near the entrance caught my attention. It displayed a name I recognized immediately: Willow Bay Resort. Below it was the logo of the HOA from the coastal neighborhood across the water. That was the moment everything changed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a neighbor borrowing space. The HOA had built an entire resort on my private island. A woman wearing a white jacket and carrying a tablet walked toward me with complete confidence. Whitmore, the president of the HOA. She smiled as if she was welcoming me to a project I had approved. "Nathaniel," she said, "I was wondering when you would finally come see what we've created." I looked around at the cabins behind her. "What exactly did you create?" Her smile remained. "A community retreat. A place everyone can enjoy." I stared at her. "Everyone except the person who owns the land?" For the first time, her expression changed slightly, but only for a second. "We understood the island was not being used," she replied. "The HOA decided it was the perfect opportunity to bring value to the area." I looked back at the 31 cabins standing where my family once spent quiet summers. She said the word value like it explained everything, but she didn't understand something important. Empty did not mean abandoned. Quiet did not mean available. And unused did not mean anyone else had the right to take it. Caroline had built an entire resort because she believed my island was waiting for someone to claim it. What she didn't know was that one document hidden in my family records would prove the island had never belonged to anyone but me. The most dangerous assumption someone can make about private property is believing that silence means permission. Caroline Whitmore looked at my island and saw empty space. She saw an opportunity waiting for someone bold enough to take it. What she never considered was that the quiet years had a reason. The island was protected because it belonged to someone. After my first conversation with Caroline, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked back to my boat and left the island. That confused her. People like Caroline expect anger because anger is easy to dismiss. They expect someone to lose control because it makes them feel powerful. But I had learned something over the years. When someone builds something they shouldn't, the first thing you need is not emotion. You need information. The next morning, I started researching everything connected to the construction project. I returned to my office and opened the old family records that had been stored away for years. My grandfather kept everything: property taxes, survey maps, ownership documents, every piece of paper that proved our connection to the island. The room was quiet except for the sound of old folders opening and pages turning. I found documents dating back decades: the original purchase records, the boundary surveys, the legal descriptions. Every page told the same story. The island belonged to my family, but I wanted to understand how Caroline believed she could build 31 cabins without contacting me. So I started looking into the HOA records. That was when I discovered the first warning sign. The project was not a small improvement. It was a full development plan. They had budgets, construction schedules, marketing ideas. They had already named the resort Willow Bay Retreat. They had spent months planning a business on land they did not own. I found architectural drawings showing the entire layout: 31 cabins, a reception building, a new dock system, walking paths through the island. They weren't testing an idea. They were creating a resort. And every single part of it was sitting on my property. The more I discovered, the more one question kept coming back. How did they convince themselves this was allowed? Then I found an HOA meeting document from several months earlier. Caroline had presented the island project to the board. One sentence immediately caught my attention: the property has remained and used for years and represents a valuable opportunity for community expansion. And used. That word explained everything. Caroline didn't see an owner. She saw an obstacle. She believed that because I wasn't constantly standing on the island, the land was somehow available. But ownership doesn't disappear when someone isn't watching. A locked door doesn't become public because nobody opens it. A private island doesn't become community property because someone wants to build on it. That evening, I called Daniel Mercer, a property attorney I had worked with before. I sent him the documents and explained what happened. His first question was simple: did you sign anything allowing construction? No. Did you lease the island? No. Did you give the HOA any development rights? No. There was a pause. Then he said something that I would remember. Then the most important question is not why they built it. The important question is what document proves they never had the right. I looked toward the old wooden cabinet where my family's records were stored. I already knew what he was talking about: the deed. The one document Caroline never asked to see. The one document that could determine the future of every cabin standing on my island. She had spent millions building a resort, but she never checked the one piece of paper that mattered most. The moment I opened the old family records, I realized something important. The island was never protected by distance. It was protected by paperwork. For years, I thought the strongest connection to that place was the memories my family created there. But sitting in that office, surrounded by documents that had survived generations, I understood that the strongest defense was something much simpler: a deed. My grandfather had always been careful with records. He believed land ownership was not just about having a piece of property. It was about preserving proof that one could take away. Every purchase agreement, every survey, and every legal document had been stored in the same wooden cabinet inside my office. I opened the final folder. Inside was the original deed to the island. The paper was old, but the information was clear. The legal description matched the boundaries I knew by heart: the shoreline, the interior land, the surrounding waters included in the private property designation. Everything belonged to me. There was no mention of the HOA, no shared ownership, no development rights, no permission for construction. I sat there for a long time looking at the document. 31 cabins, a new dock, an entire resort, millions of dollars spent, and all of it built on a foundation that did not exist. I sent the deed and the other records to Daniel Mercer. A few hours later, he called. "Grant." I reviewed everything. I waited. Based on these documents, the HOA had no authority to develop the island. Hearing those words confirmed what I already suspected. But Daniel continued. "However, we need to be careful. They have already invested significant money into construction. They will likely argue that they believe they had the right to proceed." I looked out the window toward the coastline. "They built 31 cabins without asking me." "I know," he said. "And that is going to be the problem they have to explain." That evening, I returned to the island alone. The sun was setting behind the trees, and the cabins looked almost peaceful from a distance. Fresh wood walls, new walkways, lights installed along the paths. For someone who didn't know the truth, it probably looked like progress. But I knew what it really was. A monument to someone else's assumption. I walked through the construction area and noticed small details I hadn't seen before. Signs with resort information, storage buildings, electrical connections. Everything had been designed for guests who were never supposed to be there. The next morning, Daniel helped me request additional HOA documents. We needed to understand exactly how Caroline convinced the board this was legal. A few days later, the records arrived. Inside were meeting notes, financial plans, and development proposals. One document showed the projected revenue from the resort. The HOA expected thousands of visitors every year. They had planned membership packages, seasonal rentals, private events. They had built an entire business model around my island. Then I found something that changed everything. A board member had asked a question during an early planning meeting. Do we have written approval from the island owner? Below that question was Caroline's response. The owner has not actively used the property for years. We believe development serves the greater community interest. I read that sentence several times. Not actively used. That was their excuse. Caroline didn't discover a legal right. She created one in her own mind. She saw my absence and treated it like an invitation. She saw quiet land and called it available. She saw ownership and assumed it was negotiable. But ownership was never about who visited the island the most. It was about who had the legal right to decide what happened there. And now I had the document that proved the answer. The deed had been sitting quietly in my family's records for decades. Caroline built a resort in months. But I had something much stronger. Proof that she never had the right to build it at all. The biggest projects usually fail because of the smallest things people ignore. In Caroline Whitmore's case, that small thing was a question nobody wanted to answer. Who gave you permission to build on someone else's land? After reviewing the documents, Daniel and I decided we needed more than the deed. The deed proved ownership, but we needed to understand the entire process behind the resort construction. We needed to know who approved it, who funded it, and who knew the island was privately owned. Because if Caroline had simply made a mistake, that would be one thing. But if she knew the truth and continued anyway, that would change everything. We started requesting more records from the HOA. The first documents showed the financial side of the project. The numbers were unbelievable. The board had approved millions of dollars for construction. They had hired contractors, ordered materials, and created marketing plans before a single cabin was completed. They were not building a small community project. They were building a business. Then Daniel found the construction agreement. I remember sitting in his office as he placed the document in front of me. Look at this, he said. I scanned through the pages. The contractor agreement described the location as HOA-controlled development property. That phrase immediately stood out. HOA-controlled, not HOA-owned. There was a difference, a very important difference. They had not purchased the island. They had not leased the island. They had simply decided that because they controlled the nearby community, they somehow controlled the land beyond it. Daniel continued reviewing the paperwork. There is something else. He pointed to a section near the bottom. The contractor had requested proof of land authorization before beginning construction. A standard requirement. A basic question. Where's the permission? But instead of providing my approval, the HOA submitted a different document. A neighborhood development map. A map that showed the island connected to the community. Except there was one problem. The map was not a legal ownership document. It was just a planning illustration. Caroline had used a drawing to create the appearance of authority, and everyone followed her. That discovery changed the way I viewed the situation. This was not just an overconfident HOA president making a bad decision. This was a system built on assumptions. Caroline assumed nobody would challenge her. The board assumed the project was too far along to stop. The contractors assumed the HOA had done its homework. Everyone assumed. Except nobody checked the one thing that mattered. The deed. A few days later, Caroline contacted me again. Her tone was different this time. The confidence was still there, but something underneath it had changed. We need to discuss a path forward, she said. I stood on my porch overlooking the ocean. The path forward would have been asking permission before building 31 cabins. She paused. Nathaniel, this project benefits hundreds of people. I looked toward the water. That doesn't give anyone the right to build on my property. She tried another approach. You have to understand the investment that has already been made. I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. The investment. The money. the business plan. Everything she mentioned was about what they built. Nothing was about what they took. I understand exactly what happened, I said. You invested in something you never owned. The conversation ended shortly after that. But I knew Caroline wasn't finished. People who build entire resorts based on assumptions don't easily admit they were wrong. She had spent months creating her vision. Now I was holding the one document that could bring that vision to a complete stop. The deed was no longer just proof of ownership. It was the boundary line between what Caroline imagined she controlled and what she actually had the right to touch. The moment Caroline realized I was not going to accept her explanation, her attitude changed. The confident HOA president who once walked onto my island like she owned it suddenly became someone trying to protect a project that was slipping away. But she still believed the solution was simple. She believed enough pressure could make me surrender. She was wrong. A few days after our conversation, Caroline organized a meeting with several HOA board members and investors involved in the resort project. They invited me to their office overlooking the coastline. From the large windows behind them, I could see the ocean and, in the distance, my island. The same island where they had built 31 cabins. The room was filled with expensive furniture, construction plans, and marketing presentations. It looked like a company headquarters preparing for a major launch, not a group of people defending a mistake. Caroline sat across from me with a folder in front of her. Nathaniel, we understand there are concerns, she began. Concerns. That was the word she chose. Not unauthorized construction. Not private property violation. Concerns. She continued explaining how much effort had gone into the project. She talked about the jobs created, the future visitors, and the benefits the resort would bring to the area. Everything was about what they planned to gain. Nothing was about what they had taken. Finally, she pushed a document across the table. We are willing to create a partnership agreement. I looked down. They wanted me to lease the island to them. After spending millions building without permission, they wanted me to make their decision legal after the fact. I closed the document. You built a resort on my property, and now you want me to approve it. Caroline leaned forward. You have to understand, Nathaniel, this project is already moving forward. I looked at her. No, your project is moving forward. My property was never part of your decision. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the board members asked a question that changed the entire room. Caroline, did we ever receive written authorization from Mr. Brooks? Her expression tightened. We believed authorization was unnecessary because of the circumstances. I turned toward her. The circumstances being that I wasn't there? The silence answered for her. That was when I realized something important. The board members were not all aware of the details. Caroline had presented the island as an opportunity. She had not presented it as someone else's private property. She had sold them a vision while hiding the foundation underneath it. After the meeting, Daniel reviewed the conversation and told me something I already suspected. She is trying to negotiate because she knows the deed creates a serious problem. I looked at the copy of the deed sitting on my desk. Can they stop the construction? Daniel nodded. If we prove there is no legal authorization, we can request an immediate halt to further development. An immediate halt. Those words stayed with me. Because Caroline had spent months thinking about opening a resort. She had thought about guests arriving. She had thought about revenue. She had thought about expansion. But she never thought about the possibility that everything could stop overnight. The next morning, we prepared the official legal notice. Attached were the deed, the property surveys, the construction records, the HOA planning documents. Every piece of evidence told the same story. They built on land they did not own. They developed property they had no right to use. They created a resort based on an assumption. And assumptions do not override ownership. When the notice was delivered to the HOA office, Caroline called me within hours. Her voice was no longer confident. What exactly are you trying to do? I looked out toward the ocean. I am not stopping your resort. I paused. I am protecting my island. For the first time, Caroline understood the difference. She thought I was fighting against her project. I wasn't. I was defending something that had never belonged to her in the first place. The fastest way to stop a massive project is not always a machine or a crew. Sometimes it is a single document that proves the entire foundation was built on the wrong ground. Caroline Whitmore believed her resort was too far along to fail. She believed the money invested and the number of people involved would protect her. But she forgot one thing. None of those things changed who owned the island. After the legal notice was delivered, everything changed. For the first time since I returned, the construction stopped. The sounds that had replaced the natural rhythm of my island disappeared. No more hammers. No more engines. No more workers moving between cabins that never should have existed. The silence returned. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't the peaceful silence I remembered from my childhood. It was the silence of a project that had suddenly hit a wall. Daniel informed me that the HOA's legal team requested an emergency meeting. They wanted to discuss the situation before the matter moved further. When we arrived at their office, the atmosphere was completely different from our first meeting. There were no confident presentations, no marketing plans, no talk about future guests. The resort drawings that once covered the tables were now replaced by legal documents. Caroline sat across from me, looking through the same deed that she had ignored before. "Are you really willing to shut down everything over this?" she asked. I looked at her. "This isn't about shutting something down." I pointed toward the documents. "This is about something being built without the owner's permission." She looked frustrated. "We invested millions into this project." I nodded. "And you invested millions into a property you didn't own." The room became quiet. That was the reality nobody wanted to say out loud. The HOA had spent money. They had hired people. They had created plans. But every decision they made was built on an assumption. And assumptions are expensive when they collide with ownership. The HOA attorney began explaining their position. They claimed the board believed the island was available for community development. They argued that the project was intended to benefit residents and increase local value. But Daniel asked the question that changed the conversation. "If you believed you had the right to build, why did you never request authorization from the property owner?" Nobody answered immediately, because there was no good answer. Caroline looked through her notes. "We believed the circumstances allowed us to proceed." Daniel leaned forward. "Belief is not ownership." That sentence stayed in the room, because that was the entire problem. Caroline believed. She believed in used men available. She believed community interest created authority. She believed a large enough project could make permission unnecessary. But the deed did not care about beliefs. The deed only showed facts. The following week, the official review began. County officials examined the property records, construction documents, and development plans. The results confirmed what we already knew. The island was private property. The HOA had no recorded development rights. The cabins had been constructed without proper authorization from the owner. The resort project was officially frozen. When Caroline received the decision, she called me. Her voice sounded completely different from the first day I met her. The confidence was gone. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked toward the ocean outside my window. The same thing that should have happened before construction started. A pause. "You asked permission." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly said, "You understand this affects a lot of people." I looked back. At the island. "I know." And that was the difference between us. I understood the consequences. She understood only after they arrived. Caroline built 31 cabins because she thought nobody could stop her. She was wrong. Because the strongest structure on that island was never the resort. It was the document proving it was mine. The most revealing moment in any dispute is not when someone loses. It is when they finally understand why they were never right. Caroline Whitmore spent months believing her vision was bigger than any obstacle. She thought the size of the resort would protect her. She thought the money invested would force everyone to accept what she had built. But the island did not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belonged to the person whose name was on the deed. After the official freeze was issued, everything surrounding Willow Bay Retreat changed overnight. The workers stopped arriving. The contractors stopped making progress. The opening date that Caroline had announced to investors disappeared from every schedule. The 31 cabins remained standing, but they were no longer a resort. They were evidence. I returned to the island a few days later with Daniel. The boat ride felt completely different from the first time I saw those cabins. Before, I felt shock and disbelief. Now I saw something else. A mistake frozen in place. We walked past the empty cabins, and I noticed details I had missed before. Welcome signs were already installed. Furniture had been delivered. Decorative lights lined the pathways. They had prepared everything for guests who were never supposed to arrive. Caroline had built the future she imagined. She just built it on someone else's land. Daniel photographed everything and reviewed the construction layout. He explained that every detail mattered because the evidence showed the scale of the project. "This isn't a misunderstanding anymore," he said. "The amount of planning proves they were committed to developing the property." I looked across the island. They were more committed to the resort than they were to checking if they had the right to build it. That was the part one struggled to understand. Building something that large required dozens of decisions. Meetings, contracts, approvals. At every step, someone could have asked the simplest question: do we own this land? But nobody did. Because Caroline had created a story everyone wanted to believe. The island was unused. The community needed more space. The resort would benefit everyone. The problem with stories is that they can sound true when nobody checks the facts. A week later, the HOA held another emergency meeting. This time, the mood was completely different from the first presentation I had seen. There were no celebrations, no excitement. Residents who once supported the project were now asking difficult questions. One homeowner stood and asked Caroline directly, "Did you know this island was privately owned before construction started?" The room became silent. Caroline looked uncomfortable. "We believed we had the ability to proceed." Again, that answer. Believed. Not confirmed. Not documented. Believed. Another resident asked, "Did Nathaniel ever sign an agreement allowing the resort?" Caroline looked toward the attorney beside her. Nobody answered, and that silence told everyone more than words could. The same confidence that once convinced people now made them question her judgment. After the meeting, Caroline approached me outside. The ocean breeze moved between us, and for the first time, she looked less like a leader and more like someone trying to understand how everything went wrong. "You could have worked with us," she said. I looked back toward the water. "I could have, if you had asked." She lowered her eyes. That was the entire story in one sentence. The resort did not fail because I fought against development. It failed because they skipped the one step that mattered: permission. Months earlier, Caroline saw an empty island and imagined a business opportunity. Now she was standing beside 31 empty cabins that proved one thing: an idea can be valuable. A plan can be impressive. But without the right to build, it is nothing more than a very expensive mistake. The hardest thing for someone with too much confidence is admitting that the world does not work the way they imagined. Caroline Whitmore had spent months building a vision of success. She saw the cabins, the dock, and the future guests. She saw a thriving resort that would make her HOA look powerful. What she did not see was the moment when everything she built became a liability. After the official freeze, the financial consequences started appearing quickly. Contractors demanded answers. Investors wanted explanations. Residents who once celebrated the resort began questioning why their HOA funds were connected to a project that could not legally operate. For Caroline, the island had gone from an opportunity into a problem she could not control. Daniel kept me updated as the situation developed. "The HOA is trying to find a way to minimize the damage," he told me. I looked at the documents on my desk. They spent months building without asking a simple question. Daniel nodded. "And now that question is the reason everything stopped." The county review continued for several weeks. Every document was examined carefully: the deed, the property boundaries, the construction agreements, the HOA meeting records. Each piece confirmed the same conclusion: the island was private property. The resort was unauthorized. The development could not continue. But the biggest turning point came when the HOA's own records became public during the review process. Residents discovered how quickly the project had moved forward. They saw the presentations Caroline gave. They saw the revenue projections. They saw the plans for future expansion. But they also saw what was missing. There was no signed agreement from me. No lease. No permission. No legal transfer of rights. The person who approved the entire project had never actually controlled the land. That realization changed the community. People who once believed Caroline was creating something valuable started asking different questions. One resident contacted me and said something I will never forget. "We thought she was building something for us. We didn't realize she was building something on someone else's property." That sentence captured everything. The problem was never development. The problem was entitlement. Caroline wanted the benefits of ownership without accepting the responsibilities that came with it. She wanted control without permission. She wanted authority without legal rights. A few months later, the HOA board held another meeting to discuss the future of the project. This time, Caroline was no longer standing in front of the room presenting a dream. She was answering questions. The same woman who once described the island as an opportunity now had to explain why she never verified ownership before construction began. During the meeting, one board member asked, "Would you have continued this project if you knew Nathaniel had never agreed?" Caroline stayed quiet, because the honest answer was obvious. No, the project only existed because she believed nobody would challenge it. After the meeting, Daniel and I walked along the shoreline of my island. The cabins stood behind us, empty and silent. The ocean moved gently against the dock they built. "They really thought this would become permanent," Daniel said. I looked at the buildings. "I think they believed building first would make ownership irrelevant." Daniel smiled slightly. "And now the deed proved the opposite." That was the lesson Caroline never understood. A building can be impressive. A plan can be expensive. A vision can attract hundreds of people. But none of those things can replace the simple truth written on a legal document. The island was mine before the cabins existed. It was mine while they were being built. And it remained mine after the project stopped. Caroline built 31 cabins hoping to create a resort. Instead, she created 31 reminders that ownership cannot be assumed, no matter how large the construction becomes. The most valuable thing I learned from this experience was that ownership is not proven by how much space you control. It is proven by the truth behind the documents that protect it. Caroline Whitmore built 31 cabins because she believed a big enough project could change reality. But reality never changed. The island was still mine. Months after the resort was frozen, I returned to the shoreline where everything had started. The same dock that once represented someone else's ambition now stood quiet against the waves. The cabins remained, but they were no longer symbols of growth. They were reminders. Reminders that confidence without permission can become arrogance. Reminders that development without ownership can become a mistake. And reminders that the strongest response is sometimes not destroying what someone built. It is simply proving they never had the right to build it. The final agreement required the HOA to cover the legal costs, resolve the construction issues, and restore the island according to the property requirements. The resort project was officially abandoned. The cabins that were supposed to welcome hundreds of guests never opened. The grand opening event that Caroline had planned never happened. The advertisements that promised a private island escape disappeared. The dream she created vanished because it was built on a foundation that was never hers. But the biggest change was not financial. It was what happened inside the community. Residents began asking more questions. They wanted transparency. They wanted proper reviews before major decisions. They wanted to know who was making choices and whether those choices were actually legal. Caroline had always believed authority came from being the person in charge. But she learned something different. Real authority comes from responsibility, from respecting boundaries, from understanding that leadership does not mean having the power to take what you want. It means knowing where your power ends. A few weeks later, I walked across the island with Daniel one final time before restoration work began. The morning sun reflected across the water, and the island looked more like the place I remembered from my childhood. Quiet, peaceful, unchanged by the noise that had arrived there. Daniel looked toward the empty cabins. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you never checked the deed?" I thought about that question, because it was possible. If I had ignored the strange messages, if I had believed Caroline's confidence, if I had accepted that the island was somehow becoming a community project, the resort might have continued. People might have arrived believing they had the right to be there, and my family's property could have slowly become something controlled by people who never owned it. But that didn't happen, because one old document stopped everything. The deed that had been sitting quietly in my family's records for decades became the one thing Caroline could not overcome. She had engineers. She had investors. She had contractors. She had a vision. I had a piece of paper proving the truth. And sometimes, that is all it takes. Years later, people still ask me if I regret stopping the resort. My answer is always the same. No, because I never stopped a resort. I protected my island. Caroline saw empty land and imagined a business. I saw a place where my family history still existed. She saw an opportunity. I saw a responsibility. And in the end, the lesson was simple. A person can build 31 cabins. A person can spend millions of dollars. A person can convince an entire community that they are right. But none of that matters when the foundation is built on something that was never theirs. Because justice does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it arrives as a document. And sometimes, one deed is enough to bring an entire resort back to the truth.